All right, I'm Dr. Russell F. Minton, MD. I was born in 1927 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I learned to fly as a very young man because my inspiration with aviation was from a gentleman who lived 2 doors down the street from me in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, where my father practiced medicine as a physician. When Tuskegee Airmen were approved for training, he shooed me in. I was able to get there. One fantastic training as the last class in 1945. And the story I like to tell is that when Hitler heard I was coming, he surrendered because the war was over by the time I got there and came back. Well, I've found that there are innumerable misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen. First of all, the General Hap Arnold was running the United States Army Air Corps in the late 30s and early 40s, and he was from the same hometown, Ardmore, Pennsylvania, that I was. Actually, he's from Wynwood, but he lived right close to the high school. And he was firmly convinced that blacks were too stupid to be taught to fly airplanes. Yet the gentleman who lived 2 doors down from me, Alf Anderson, was a airline transport rated pilot. And in 1933, he had flown with a black dentist from Atlantic City, the first transcontinental round trip from Atlantic City to Los Angeles and back by blacks, and it came to the attention of then Senator Harry Truman, who became interested in following what they were doing. And it's very firmly believed by lots of people that Eleanor Roosevelt, being such a bleeding heart liberal, just bugged FDR to death to institute you've got to set up a program to train these boys to fly airplanes. And Franklin finally said, oh, all right, Eleanor. But that, president doesn't have the funds to do anything like that. And that isn't how Eleanor had anything to do with the establishment of the training program. What it did do was Franklin was firmly convinced that the Navy was the salvation to peace. He was a naval man. He'd been the Secretary of the Navy, and he thought battleships across the Atlantic would keep America safe. And a couple of his cronies informed him that that was wrong. They had been over in Europe, and they said World War II is coming down the pike, and you can't stop it, and it's going to be won not on the sea, but in the air. And America doesn't have enough pilots to put one squadron up at this time. This was in about 34. So Franklin said, what can I do? And they advised him to take money that he did have funds to do and to establish civilian pilot training programs in colleges and universities throughout the United States. And he agreed to do that. And he told Eleanor that. And Eleanor had a very good friend, Mary Bethune-Cookman, who was the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, a black college in the Tampa area. And Eleanor told Mary, and Mary said, Eleanor, I want you to promise me one thing. And Eleanor said, what? She said, promise me you'll get FDR to give some of that training money to black colleges. And she did do that, and Franklin did donate funds to 5 black colleges for flight training programs, and Hampton and Howard and Tuskegee were 3 of those schools. And it was West Virginia State, North Carolina State, and I forget the 6th one, senile moment. But that was what how it came to pass. And Alf Anderson was a Tuskegee Institute student, and he had gone back and participated in the training of pilots out of Tuskegee. And my father taught chemistry at Tuskegee Institute under George Washington Carver during that same time, and he met Alf Anderson, and Alf took him up to fly. And it was also Alf Anderson who gave Eleanor a ride in the Piper Cub. It wasn't one of the Tuskegee Airmen cadets, and it wasn't in a advanced retractable gear trainer. It was in a Piper Cub. And she rode with him, much to the consternation of the Secret Service who were down there. But that's where he came on, and he followed me. The first signatures in my flight training logbook are from Alf Anderson. And he just kept me informed of what was going on. I was privy to the test that they were giving to see if we were smart enough to be allowed to learn to fly, and every time they showed it to me, I answered all the questions correctly, and they kept giving me the test over and over again, like I would forget or something. I don't know what the purpose was, but they did. And I graduated from high school when I was 15, which was a pain because everybody else had driver's licenses and drinking privileges and things, and I had none of that. So I was in college, Pennsylvania, let's say Penn State College, and I finished my sophomore year, and that was my 18th birthday that July, and that's when Alf Anderson called me and ushered me through. The flight training program was to die for. You got ground school, you got flight training, and you flew. I learned a lot of things about aviation and about the military's concepts of blacks in aviation from people who were predecessors of mine. I had a very good friend who just died, Hiram Mann, who was one of the earliest trainees, and he explained to me how the first airplanes that they gave the Tuskegee Airmen beyond the training planes were what most people were familiar with, the Flying Tigers, the airplane with the tiger shark mouth painted on it. Well, those airplanes, Curtiss P-40s, were obsolete by 1939, but Claire Chennault had a squadron of them in China, and he worked out tactics that would enable them to survive the Japanese fighter planes, which were much better aircraft. But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the federal government pulled Chennault and his Flying Tigers back to the United States and put them in the Air Corps, and they took the airplanes and they took all the ones that they could get and put them back together again, remanufactured them, cannibalized some to make others, and Curtiss had stopped building them. Those are the airplanes they gave to the Tuskegee Airmen. And their training was they gave them a handbook, and you memorized the handbook, and then you sat in the P-40 and you learned to touch all of the dials and knobs, and then blindfolded you had to do it. And then they were allowed to start it up, and the instructor knelt on the wing with the open canopy, and he fired up the engine, advanced the throttles, and taxied faster and faster and faster, and finally you got it to where you lifted the tail up, and at that point the instructor stepped off the wing and said, "Take it up." And that's why there were more Tuskegee Airmen who died in training crashes than were ever shot down in combat. But that was the way that you learned to fly. And the need for fighter pilots was so desperate, over in Randolph Field in Texas, where they were training the Caucasian fighter pilots, they were taking guys with 20, 25 hours of flight training time and sending them over to England and putting them in combat. And the Luftwaffe was begging, please send us some more of those. We love painting those little American flags on our Messerschmitts. When they finally finished training the first classes of Tuskegee Airmen cadets, the government had absolutely no plans whatsoever what to do with them because they didn't think anybody would ever graduate. And in fact, rumor has it, the reason that the military picked Tuskegee as the place to establish the flight school rather than any of the other 6, they figured it was so far out of in the boondocks that nobody, when it failed and they shut it down, nobody would ever know that it had ever existed. So as a result, class after class after class kept graduating. And they had no papers, no orders, no nothing. So eventually you had quite a mass of trained pilots, and there were all these airplanes sitting out there, polished and full of fuel. You know, I'm sure you saw Top Gun, the movie, and how they trained each other by having mock dogfights with one another. Well, the Tuskegee Airmen did that in Tuskegee. By the time the military finally decided that they would send them into combat, they had more hours than some of the Luftwaffe. They were better, by their bigotry, they made better fighter pilots out of them by enabling them to learn more, become more familiar with their aircraft. The Tuskegee Airmen have had more interventions in history than they will, even to this day, admit. When Curtis stopped building the P-40s and they used up all of the parts to keep the P-40s flying, they originally shipped them over and they were used by the Tuskegee Airmen, and their assignment was to fly desert patrol. And after they'd been there for about 6 weeks, some of the bigots who had originally agreed to fund the training program just so they could set to rest once and for all the ridiculous notion that anybody black could learn to fly an airplane, are now saying, see, we told you they were worthless. They've been over there 6 weeks and they hadn't shot down a single enemy plane. Well, there wasn't a single enemy plane within 600 miles of where they were sending the Tuskegee Airmen. And they were assigning them to infantry commanders, and the infantry did not understand the airplane. It was a cannon or a machine gun that was over there somewhere, and they were giving them assignments that were impossible to achieve. So the Tuskegee Airmen came up with the concept, why don't you let one of us pilots go up on the line with the infantry people and explain to the pilot what it is you want, and let the pilot call in the mission. And that was such a wonderful idea, and it worked so well that the Army Air Force now still uses that same forward observer concept. When the P-40s finally ran out, they gave the Tuskegee Airmen another airplane, a wonderful, worthless fighter plane, the Bell Airacobra, the P-39. And you don't see that being mentioned anywhere, but that's what they flew. It had a cannon in the nose, 37 millimeter cannon, and a couple of machine guns. It was a lousy fighter, but they discovered where they were assigned to fly this patrol in the North Africa route. There was a gentleman down below them named Erwin Rommel, who'd been tasked by Hitler. They sent him over with 800 tanks, and his mission was to go across Africa through Egypt and capture the Suez Canal. And you heard about, everybody has been told how Erwin Rommel was defeated in the North African desert by Field Marshal Montgomery, who just outwitted him at every turn. It's ridiculous. Rommel whipped Montgomery every time they met up with each other. But every time Rommel met up with Montgomery, he had a few less tanks than he had before, because every time the Tuskegee Airmen in their desert patrols came across a German tank, they found out that they could blow it up with a cannon in that Airacobra. By the time Rommel got to El Alamein, he was down to 43 tanks. And he had to give up. And that was the farthest that Hitler's battle group ever got in World War II, was El Alamein, and the tide was turned by the Tuskegee Airmen, not by Montgomery. And from that moment on, it was continual contraction of the Axis extension. And that there's no way you can read that except in if you read the squadron reports of the Tuskegee Airmen. You'll see that these airplanes were used and they flew missions and they shot up tanks. But nobody ever has given them credit for that. They finally allowed Tuskegee Airmen to participate in actual combat conditions when they invaded Anzio in Italy. And the Anzio beachhead was protected by Tuskegee Airmen in P-40s and Airacobras. There have been 3 movies made about Tuskegee Airmen, and none of them really is very factual. And public radio has, or PBS I should say, has 2 or 3 documentaries that are much more accurate concerning the activities of the Tuskegee Airmen. There's only one man in the Tuskegee Airmen who's been accredited with being an ace, which is 5 victories, but everybody in the Tuskegee Airmen knows that there were many people who had 5 kills, but they couldn't get them confirmed because nobody would admit that they saw it, because they didn't want them to be ever showing up. The P-47 was the first line fighter plane that they finally decided to allow the Tuskegee Airmen to fly. And it was used for escort of the bombers because Hap Arnold was still convinced that daylight bombing of the German industry was the way to win the war. And at that time, they would send in flying fortresses, which held a crew of 10, and they were sending them over in flights of 100 and losing 60 of them on every raid, which meant that there was 600 men every time they flew a raid. And the biggest reason that they were losing these aircraft was because the escort aircraft would usually not be able to hook up with the bombers, or they would leave the bombers to go off and dogfight, and then the German Luftwaffe would just decimate the bombers. So the need to protect the bombers and make a reputation for protecting them was seen by B.O. Davis, who was the commandant of the 99th Pursuit Squadron at that time, was to command every single Tuskegee Airman, you stay and you defend the bombers. We do not want you, anybody who goes off and chases fighter planes for glory will be grounded and put to work digging latrines. And the word got out to the bomber crews that these airplanes with the red tails painted on them really stick with us and help us out. And it got to when they finally announced it, a raid in Berlin, the lead bomber group requested those red tail guys. They didn't know they were black. They just knew that was the squadron of aircraft that was protecting them the best, and that's who they wanted. And to show you how racism, even at that point, was still there, the P-47s were the largest fighter plane, I think, that had ever been built up until that point. And it would pass anything out there except a gas station. It didn't have enough fuel to go on this trip and back. And fortunately, the P-51 Mustang came on the scene about that time. And that was also serendipitous because it was not an American request. It was a British request. The P-51 Mustang was designed in answer to the Brits' request for a fighter plane to replace their Spitfire. They didn't have enough money to do R&D and repairs at the same time. And the P-51 was designed on the back of an envelope, like almost overnight. And they flew, I think, 6 or 7 of them over to England, to Biggin Field. And the Brits loved it until they found out that once it got above 8,000 feet, it couldn't get out of its own way. And they said, cancel the order, we don't want them, send them back. And at Biggin Field was a Spitfire hangar, air base, and they were changing engines in Spitfires with the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine. And some of the mechanics who were doing that work were also being instructed in stripping down these Mustangs to send them back to the United States. And the rumor is that one of them looked at the other, and they looked at the Merlin engine and they looked at the Allison engine, and they said they looked like they could be inter-swapped. Let's put one of these Rolls-Royce engines in the Mustang, and it fit, and thus was born the most fantastic fighter plane with a propeller on the front of it that's ever been conceived, because with the laminar flow wing and the supercharged engine, the Mustang became the aircraft that could escort the bombers all the way and could outfly any of the German Luftwaffe fighter aircraft. And that's what happened, except that they discovered the airplane came with 2 75-gallon drop tanks for extra fuel. And they say with those 2 tanks, fuel could become critical. If you get a headwind or something, you're going to lose a lot of planes from running out of fuel. So, but the Thunderbolts, the P-47s, have 150-gallon tanks. If we could hang Thunderbolt fuel tanks on Mustangs, we'll have no problem. And the word went out amongst all the crew chiefs, scrounge up some Thunderbolt tanks and rig them to the Mustangs. And all of a sudden, all of the Thunderbolt bases couldn't find any tanks. They didn't want us to have them. And the night before that raid to Berlin, the crew chiefs at Ramitelli Field, where the Tuskegee Airmen were, suddenly requisitioned all of the 3/4-ton vehicles and the M1 carbines they could find, and the mechanic crews disappeared. And the Thunderbolt fields got raided, and they took all of their fuel tanks and brought them back. And they were up all night long jury rigging these P-47 tanks to fit P-51s. And the word went up to the higher echelon people who were outraged at them having done this. And they told, don't you drop any of those tanks, you bring them all back. Well, that doesn't make much sense either. The reason that they're drop tanks is so because when you're in combat, you drop them to remove drag and so forth. The guys who went over by ship and then flew were put back on the ships and returned to the States. And when the ships, now all these guys are lieutenants, captains, 1 or 2 majors, they've all got combat experience. They got back to the United States, and the troop ships that they were on dropped anchor, and to be repatriated, they had to follow signs that said black troops, white troops, back to segregation before they could set foot in America again. There was also a squadron of Tuskegee Airmen who were trained in twin-engine B-25 bombers, which are not well known. B-25 bombers are well known because they was the 30 seconds over Tokyo, the first raid on. But for some reason, they never assigned them to any combat. But they were moved from base to base. And in Georgia, they went to the officers' club, because they were all officers by then. And they were told they couldn't be served at the officers' club because they weren't permanent members of the base. And they said there's no base in the United States that has that as a rule. If you're an officer, you're an officer, and you can eat and drink in the officers' club. And they called out the provost marshal, who called out the MPs, who showed up with submachine guns to prevent them from entering the officers' club. And there was a small group who took great exception to that and supposedly, allegedly jostled one of the MPs, and they were rounded up and put in jail. And Harry Truman was now president, and he remembered following the Tuskegee Airmen, and he instructed his attorney general, you get down to Georgia and you get everybody out. I don't care what you have to do. And he had a piece of paper that he'd been agonizing over that called for desegregation of the armed services. And he had spoken with all the chiefs of staff of all of the branches of the military, and they all had told him, oh my God, you do that, it'll destroy the military. You can't possibly do that. No, 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 no. But after he heard what they had done with the Tuskegee Airmen, he signed the ordinance which desegregated the military. So as far as I'm concerned, Harry Truman is one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. He dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which saved millions of American lives that they would have lost if they'd had to invade Japan. And also, very few people know that the Japanese had an atomic bomb. The Germans sent it to them by submarine before the Germans surrendered, and they had exploded one test of it. And that's why Truman said, drop the bomb, to prove to them that we have it. And it wasn't because they were racist and wanted to do in the Japanese. They wanted to do in the Japanese before the Japanese did in them. And the Japanese had planned to drop their version of the atomic bomb on the West Coast, probably San Francisco.